In today's world, we find ourselves playing retro games more than ever, whether that's through online emulators or original hardware. There are certain situations where some people will prefer to play the original systems like Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis, while others will prefer to emulate the games for more accessibility. Which raises the question, what is the best option for playing retro games? To find out, we'll be comparing these devices based on 5 key criteria: cost, game selection, controls, performance and accuracy, and overall play experience. Let's see how well they stack up against each other. First up, we have the original consoles: PlayStation 1, Super Nintendo Entertainment System, and the Sega Genesis. The original console will be the definitive way to play your games, but the biggest hurdle will be the physical games themselves. Some of the harder games to find are either becoming impossible to come across or being overly priced, as many sought-after titles run between $50 to over $1,000. Not to mention, out of all of the devices, the most expensive option is the original console for both the cost of the system and the games. It's usually a hit or miss if you can get a good working system or willing to fix or pay for repairs. Overall, you're limited to the games you're willing to pay to own. So if you're in the market to just play games and not collect, I would recommend to stay away from this option. As far as performance and controls, the results vary based on the television being used. I've tested out each console on both a flat screen TV and a CRT TV. The colors appear to pop more when playing on older screens, due to the image quality that was intended to be played on older TVs. Also, I did notice there was some input latency when going from an AV signal to a digital signal. For instance, I clock each button press from the time it will display on the screen to match the exact millisecond the game will register each press, with an extraordinarily little issue on game input. However, there is a slight delay when using the AV to HDMI component cables, resulting in a 1.24 millisecond delay from button press to on-screen results. This may not be entirely noticeable for the average gamer, but some enthusiasts may see the difference. For our next option, we have retro minis, such as the Super Nintendo, Sega Genesis, and PlayStation 1 mini. The original market value started around $80, but have gone upwards in many cases to $200 or more. This price point can be steep to play older games. The Nintendo, Sega, and PlayStation minis are no longer in production, but there are still plenty of retro console minis available through sellers on Amazon, eBay, or even your local game store. Beware of third parties or off markets that attempt to sell fake retro minis. When testing out the retro minis, compared to a Raspberry Pi and original console, it was almost a one-to-one comparison to the original system. The mini allows you to play games in the original 4:3 aspect ratio in a pixel-perfect mode that offers smoother lines, but shrinks the overall game screen, or with the CRT filter that gives it a classic retro look that imitates the CRT TV. Also, I experienced little to no input lag, and every game played is just as good as the original version. Also, the modding capabilities are endless, as you can pretty much add the entire platform library to it if you wanted to. I started with 32 built-in games for Super Nintendo, 20 built-in games for PS1, and 42 built-in games for Sega Genesis. Now, I have a plethora of games on each mini. Modding the mini to add more games is an amazingly simple process. Third in line is the Raspberry Pi. We purchased the Raspberry Pi 4B emulator kit completed with 2 controllers, a case that looks like an NES, a power supply, micro SD card, and all the trimmings for about $100 on Amazon. Once I got the Raspberry Pi, I followed the instructions to put it together and configured the software using RetroPie to install about 12 games for testing. In case I haven't mentioned it already, these are the same games I used to test for all of the devices, in case you were wondering. For the Raspberry Pi, it performed very well when playing 8-bit and 16-bit titles, as the colors and sound details were on point, but there's other areas that were lackluster performance-wise. For example, I noticed the Pi will often run warm when running demanding games such as Super Mario World, Street Fighter 2, and Killer Instinct. In addition, controls on certain games work decently, but other games would tend to have the most issue in terms of how slow or unresponsive those games would run.
Oh my goodness.
For instance, I noticed when playing Street Fighter 2, the frame rates dropped with each button press. When I played against an opponent, I found myself experiencing slow motion gameplay with the continuous frame rate skips. Not to mention, the delay in button press was terrible compared to playing the same game on original hardware. The jump or attack button didn't feel responsive, and there were a few frame stutters from time to time. It is highly recommended to do additional research to make sure your ROMs are working properly. Last but certainly not least, PC emulators. If you currently own a PC or a laptop, PC emulators is one of the best ways to play retro games because of their ease of use, normally solid performance, and tons of online support and information. In case you wanted to know my current specs for testing, here are my current specs for my CPU, GPU, and RAM. And I already have a frame rate and CPU counter to test these emulators. There are different apps you can download onto your computer to test these emulators if you don't already have these on your PC. For the cost, the option is free, assuming that you already own a modern PC or a personal laptop. But for the people who would like to play in their living room, then maybe a Raspberry Pi or a Retro Mini could be an option for you. For games, PC emulators will give you an endless amount of game options, just like the Raspberry Pi, but finding the right emulator and ROMs to run can be time consuming. I found myself configuring emulators to work for my exact specifications, so keep that in mind and understand that this will take some time. Once configured, I noticed different emulators varied on performance. For example, I tried out the SNES emulator and it worked flawlessly. The emulator had a resolution scaler and a full screen support that allowed me to seamlessly play through any game that I threw at it. I know that I used the same Super Nintendo games to test on the other devices, but I decided to have a little bit more fun with this one. I started playing other games like Doom, Shadowrunner, Secret of Evermore, and much more. This emulator supported all of my controller options with little to no input latency or lag. Although it has some occasional dips when a lot of the action was happening on scene, it wasn't anything detrimental to the overall performance. On the flip side, I used another emulator called EPXE to play mostly PS1 games. Some games ran fine, but others like the Twisted Metal, Metal Gear Solid, Crash Bandicoot, and Spyro had a few hiccups. I experienced a few frame rate shudders and cutscenes that will sometimes fade to black in and out. I ended up using a different ROM for these games and got it to work out slightly better, but I did notice some slowdown issues, so I wouldn't necessarily say one outshined the other. They both did kind of poor in performance. Each option has advantages and disadvantages when reviewing my overall experience. For some options, I must configure the games and controls to work properly, while others I can plug in the power cord and play right away. It really depends on how much time I'm willing to spend in order to just play a game. For the Raspberry Pi, it may require a little technical knowledge and additional research to get certain games working properly. I appreciate the ability to use assortment of different controllers to play games, and it's a nice way to do away with having multiple devices to play my games on. On the other hand, installing programs and finding the games to download were a turnoff, especially if the ROM doesn't work properly. For the Retro Minis, this is the simplest way to play retro games because it's a plug-and-play device in a literal sense. I appreciate the save state features that allows you to save your games at any time and pick up where you left off, which is a super convenient feature that I wish I had back in the day. Also, the modding capabilities allowed me to add the entire library if I wanted to. The downside to each mini is limited to only the built-in games that release, because if I did not mod my system, I would be stuck with a handful of awesome classics with filler games remaining. As much as I love original consoles, the biggest turnoff is finding the game to play on the system. Now granted, I do have a plethora of games within my current catalog to play, so my overall experience may be neutral. However, when measured up against a PC emulator that can play literally any Nintendo or Sega game, the original console is unmatched compared to the emulators. I have a list of games I would like to purchase in physical form, but many of these games are over $200 or rare to find in person. I can't commit myself to purchasing expensive titles unless it's a Dracula X or Chrono Trigger. Even then, those games are still difficult to find. PC emulators have unlimited access to a wide variety of retro system libraries with zero limitations on the ways you can access and play them. For the downside, it's a bit frustrating to try to find different emulators that may work properly depending on which system I'm trying to emulate. For example, When trying to run an N64 or Sega Genesis emulator, it is a lot simpler to emulate compared to the Sega Dreamcast or PlayStation 1 emulator. Your best bet is to emulate games that is anything 8 or 16-bit, but you may run into a bit more issues with a 32-bit or more type of game. In addition, 3D games did not run as smoothly as I hoped for compared to the 2D counterparts. Overall, the original console are the most authentic way to play video games, but the cost per game will be the biggest turnoff for most people unless you're into collecting older games and consoles. If you can mod your Retro Mini for a bigger game library, go for it. The PC emulator is overall the most flexible and cheapest option unless you want to play games in your living room. Then maybe the Raspberry Pi is an option too. Your experience may vary, but once it's configured and running perfectly, it's a retro gamer's dream.